Over the course of history, some ships are considered unlucky, for better or worse. It could be because they took embarrassing damage. It could also be a tendency to run aground, or any number of other such things. And then there's the German light cruiser, Leipzig. Was she unlucky in the damage she took from a torpedo and being rammed by a larger German cruiser? Or was she lucky for surviving the damage and the war itself? That's an interesting question, and one could make arguments in either direction. In any event, let's take a look at the career of Leipzig, from the mundane early years to the hectic war years. Laid down on April 28, 1928, and launched on October 18, 1929, Leipzig was the first of a class of two light cruisers. Although one could argue that the two ships are half-sisters, at best. Regardless, they were an improved take on the previous Königsberg design. The major improvements with the newer cruisers coming from their armor and main battery arrangement. However, in both cases, it should be noted that improvement is probably stretching things a tad bit. I'll briefly cover the technical details in the usual format. Leipzig carried 9 15cm, 5.9-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. The exact same guns as her predecessor, and broadly similar turrets. The only major difference here coming in thicker armor on the turret faces. 80mm compared to 30mm on the older ships. As well as a change in layout. Leipzig carried her guns in a more standard centerline arrangement compared to the offset turrets of her predecessor. Both classes are somewhat unique in carrying 2 of their 3 turrets on the stern. This is good if you need to run away from an enemy. For a surface raider, it's actually not that bad of an idea. This was supported by 2 88mm anti-aircraft guns and 12 50cm 20-inch torpedo tubes, at least as built. The 88mm guns were in single mounts, while the torpedoes were carried in 4 triple tube mounts. 2 on either side of the ship, around the funnel. Armor protection was, again, almost identical to the older German cruisers. A maximum of 50mm, or 2 inches, on the main belt. And a slightly thinner deck at 30mm compared to 40mm. The only notable change being an increased angle on the belt to improve practical protection. All of this was fitted to a hull that displaced 8,100 tons at full load on Leipzig. Her sister was slightly larger at 9,000 tons. In a somewhat special move for the time, the cruisers were mostly built by welding, not riveting. Their hulls were 90% welded, in fact, in an attempt to save weight. That aside, the ships could manage 32 knots on a combined 71,000 shaft horsepower through 3 shafts. I say combined because these ships use both steam turbines and diesel engines. That classic German fascination with using diesel engines on their warships that stretched back to the Great War. In the case of Leipzig, she was fitted with 6 traditional oil-fired boilers for 2 steam turbines driving the outer screws. Then there were 4 diesel engines driving the central shaft. It was an interesting layout, to be sure, but that rounds out the technical details. As built, that is, although both ships would be modified over the course of their careers. Which we'll now return to. We left off with Leipzig being launched in October 1929 in Wilhelmshaven. Her fitting out process was a standard affair, lasting until October 8, 1931, when she was commissioned into the Reichsmarine, almost exactly 2 years after her launch. Her initial career after this commissioning went about how you could expect. Leipzig spent her early career, from 1931 until the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, on the usual things. working up and training in the Baltic from her commissioning until 1934, along with the odd port visit here and there. In any event, during 1934, the cruiser would receive her first notable refit. This was in keel and saw two major changes. First, replacing the single 88mm guns with new twin mounts. This was a 1-for-1 change, leading to her anti-aircraft battery going from 2 guns to 4 guns. Still not exactly awe-inspiring, but for 1934, not terrible either. The other major change was the fitting of her aircraft catapult between her bridge and funnel. This change is very easy to see when you compare pictures from before the refit and after it. When that refit was done, it was back to more port visits and training. This included a trip to Britain in 1934 alongside Königsberg. The two ships are seen here, moored in Portsmouth, during that visit. That being said, the Goodwill visits made up only a small portion of her time. Most of it was spent on training and other exercises. For example, in 1935, the cruiser joined the antique pre-dreadnought Schlesien, the brand new Panzerschiff Deutschland, and the cruiser Köln on a major exercise. And then, later in the year, the man with the funny mustache paid her a visit. It was also during 1935 that the Reichsmarine changed to the Kriegsmarine, although that had little to do with Leipzig, other than a change of flag. 1936, meanwhile, would prove to be a more exciting year. First was a trip out to the Atlantic, with Nuremberg and Köln for fleet exercises. And then, in August, Leipzig began neutrality patrols off the Spanish coast. The Spanish Civil War had kicked off, and this saw an eclectic group of ships from many different navies sailing off the Spanish coast on similar patrols. This lasted until June 1937. At that point, Leipzig was, allegedly, attacked with torpedoes by Spanish Republican forces. If this actually happened or not doesn't really matter. Just the report of it was enough for Germany and Italy to withdraw from the neutrality patrols. Leipzig then returned to the Baltic, where she would ultimately spend most of her career. The remainder of 1937 and 1938 was spent on more training, as could be expected. However, we now reach 1939. This year began with the cruiser participating in the German annexation of Memel from Lithuania. That was on March 23, 1939. After that came more training through the middle of the year, including sorties into the Atlantic with larger ships in a prelude to what Germany attempted during the war. In any case, these exercises kept the cruiser busy for the rest of the year, until, that is, September 1st, 1939. When Germany invaded Poland, Leipzig was initially assigned to bottle up the Polish Navy. In this, she failed, as several ships made their escape to the Atlantic and Britain. Following that, she was put to work laying minefields in the North Sea, much as German cruisers had done in the previous war. Nothing special to this point. Don't worry though, that will come soon enough. First, however, Leipzig would spend late September through November 1939 laying mines and training. It wasn't until November 21st that she sailed out into the North Sea to actually hunt Allied shipping. This came to nothing, however, as did a stint escorting the Scharnhorst sisters out to sea. She then covered their return on the 27th of November. That being said, this brings us to December 1939, and where Leipzig's luck took a decided turn for the worse. On December 13th, 1939, Leipzig and her sister Nuremberg were escorting a group of destroyers and other ships for yet more mine-laying in the North Sea. This time, however, the British were ready. HMS Salmon, a relatively small S-class submarine, was lying in wait. Around 11 a.m. on the 13th of December, Salmon fired a spread of torpedoes. This would end up hitting both of the German cruisers. Nürnberg was hit in the bow, with relatively minor damage as a result. I say relatively minor, but it still wasn't particularly fun for the cruiser. Leipzig, on the other hand, was about to have a very bad time. She was hit below the waterline, right in her boiler room. The explosion was strong enough to bend her armor deck and damage her keel. 1,700 or so tons of water flooded into the ship, made worse by damage to her electrical system. Considering that system powered, among other things, her pumps. Yeah, she was having a very bad day. 2 out of 3 of Leipzig's boiler rooms were flooded, which, combined with damage to her steam lines, shut down the port turbine. However, Leipzig did not sink, nor did Nürnberg, denying Salmon the glory of a double kill. Not to say that the ordeal was over, however. Leipzig and her sister were attacked multiple times on the return home. Another torpedo, which would likely have sunk Leipzig, narrowly missed. The RAF threw 20 Vickers Wellingtons at the cruisers as well. These were intercepted, with 6 of the bombers lost in the attack. All of this did end up failing to sink Leipzig. She limped into Kiel, where her damage was judged too severe for complete repairs. Instead, she was removed from combat service and converted into a training ship. 4 of her boilers, likely the ones that were flooded out, were removed, leaving her with just 2 boilers and the 4 diesel engines. This was ostensibly done to make more space for training crews. I'm not quite sure why you would stuff them in the boiler rooms, but it's what they decided to do. Those repairs and the conversion kept Leipzig in dry dock until late 1940. Her career, after returning to service, would prove to be mostly uneventful, at least for the most part. There were moments other than training to look at, however. The first bit of non-training duty was in June 1941, when she escorted the Panzerschiff Lützow, her old friend Deutschland under a new name, to Norway. Upon returning to the Baltic after that, Leipzig joined the older cruiser Emden in providing shore bombardment in support of Operation Barbarossa. She would return to the Eastern Baltic to do much the same in September of 1941. This time the cruiser bombarded the Estonian islands, where she was attacked, unsuccessfully, by another submarine. A Soviet one that failed to land a hit. Lucky for Leipzig, considering what Salmon had previously done to her. That aside, during the later portion of September, she joined up with the new battleship Tirpitz. This formation was put together to prevent the Soviet Baltic Fleet from making a breakout. When one considers the state of the Soviet surface forces, well, that probably would not have ended well for the Russians. Unsurprisingly, no such breakout attempt was made. Leipzig split off from Tirpitz, returning to Kiel in October 1941. Fleet maneuvers with Admiral Scheer followed, before Leipzig became the flagship of Germany's training fleet. The remainder of 1942 and the early part of 1943 was spent on training. By this point, however, the ship was in need of an overhaul. This refit, which took place in 1943, was her last major overhaul, for a reason that will soon become obvious. First, though, she returned to escort duties in September of 1944. This saw her cover troop convoys alongside Admiral Scheer. This was all well and good. October of 1944, however, would prove to be less fortunate for the cruiser. On October 14th, Leipzig was sailing off the German coast on her way to pick up a load of mines once again. Why the training cruiser is being used to lay minefields is a question for later. For now, we meet a much more famous cruiser. Prinz Eugen is, after all, a name that needs no introduction. Leipzig was about to get to know her a tad bit too well. Sailing in thick fog, Leipzig was in the middle of switching from her diesel engines, used for cruising speeds, to her remaining boilers. This required disconnecting the diesels from the shafts and switching to the turbines. This temporarily left the cruiser without propulsion power, drifting at the mercy of the current. Prinz Eugen, blissfully unaware, was steaming into the fog at a healthy 20 knots. The result is to be expected. Leipzig drifted into the path of Prinz Eugen, with the heavy cruiser slamming into her bow first. The larger ship cut into Leipzig on her port side, just ahead of her funnel, right where the aircraft would have been had that not been removed in 1941. This collision was so violent that the top of Prinz Eugen's bow stuck out over the other side of Leipzig. She nearly cut the older cruiser clean in half. It destroyed the number 3 engine room, flooded one of the others, and killed or wounded 39 men. While Prinz Eugen escaped with relatively minor damage, shown here, Leipzig was deemed beyond repair. The bare minimum was done to keep her afloat, and she was otherwise left in place in the port of Gotenhaven. Here she would remain until March 1945. Leipzig may not have been fit for much at this point, but her guns still worked. As such, those guns were put to use, bombarding Red Army troops as they marched ever deeper into Germany. Until, that is, March 24th, 1945. Leipzig was loaded up with refugees, and the crippled light cruiser sailed to safer waters. Capable of only 6 knots, she dodged Soviet air attack and 2 attempts by submarines to finish what Salmon had started years before. By April 29th, the cruiser was in Denmark, where she was left to rot for the little remaining of the war. Leipzig was in such poor condition at this point that she wasn't taken by one of the Allied navies. Her sister Nuremberg had ended up in the Soviet Union. But poor Leipzig? Well, she was used as a barrack ship. Until, ultimately, Leipzig was scuttled in July 1946. Leipzig didn't have the most exciting career in terms of combat, but that doesn't mean it wasn't an interesting career. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.